Hello, and welcome to the U.S. Chamber Foundation's 50th Path Forward program. During our last episode, we began exploring one of the pandemic's lasting business impacts, remote work. We heard from a panel of experts who discussed how employers can keep workers happy, productive, and engaged as we navigate this new era. Today, we wanted to unpack these themes further and consider hybrid work's impact more broadly. We'll continue our conversation about what it means for employers and employees, and we'll discuss what the future of work means for physical spaces, office parks, business districts, cities, and communities across the country. Joining us today is Jeanine Turner, professor at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business and author of Being Present. Next, we will welcome Arpit Gupta, associate professor of finance at New York University's Sloan School of Business. Then we'll talk to Mark Grinis, Global Real Estate, Hospitality, and Construction Leader at EY. Finally, joining us from Cisco is Sara Morales, Vice President of People and Communities. Start submitting your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the program. Let's turn first to Professor Jeanine Turner. Thank you so much for being with us today. On a personal note, I always learned so much from you when I was at Georgetown, and I'm delighted to share your wisdom with a broader audience today. You know, it's so interesting as I talk to CEOs around the country, big companies, small companies, every industry, sector, geography, people are really struggling with how quickly the world of work changed. So let me ask you to start. What's changed about how we're all communicating?
So I think when you think about what's changed really since 2007, when really the iPhone really and other type of digital devices started to diffuse, we had this gradual distraction of a digital device in the middle of every conversation we had. And then I think it became even more the case. It exploded within the pandemic where we had the kind of collision of work and home. And so now what we're really trying to do is figure out where are our boundaries and what boundaries are there if we have our phone and our work and our family and everything connected really within the same device.
So you talk a lot about presence, and I think presence has changed a lot too. We had different cues when we were in person or different cues when everyone was remote the same way. Hybrid seems to be changing our cues, our culture, and the ways we think about presence. What advice are you giving executives these days?
So when I think about presence, I think a lot of times we think of mindfulness, and I really think people have to, on a moment by moment basis, consider what I call their social presence. How are they engaging with someone socially? And that could be I'm in person and other people are in person, but we also have people hybrid, or I'm trying to connect with someone over text, or I'm on a video call and I'm trying to figure out what my audience is doing and how they're being present, because the different types of social presence have an impact on the type of attention we have. Because the more that we have many different messages coming in from different devices, we get distracted from any one conversation. So we're constantly pulled from one conversation to the next. And I think that has a huge impact on how we can be socially present. We actually have to think about it, how we're present to someone else and how we're going to command the attention of other people in every conversation we have.
Does that mean to you that empathy has become more important as a leadership skill?
Absolutely, because when you think about it, every communication has both content and relationship aspects. And I think what we tend to focus on is the content, conveying information. People need to really hear this information. But as human to human conversation, it's also about the relationship. What I say to you and what someone else says to you is different just because of the relationship I have. And that empathy that you're talking about is about understanding who my audience is as a human being, what constraints they're dealing with, and how that content is going to have an impact on them. And a lot of those relationship cues are missing or muted in many of these environments.
It's interesting that you say that, because I remember work you did a long time ago, way before the pandemic, about how none of us are as good at multitasking as we think we are. And now you take that into a concept about multi-communicating. Can you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. Because multitasking, we all think we can do it, or everybody else is not good, but I'm good, right? Only about 3% of the population is a super tasker. So just like putting a square peg in a square hole and a round peg in a round hole, that is multitasking, hard to do, right? Especially if we're dealing with much more complex tasks. A communication task is incredibly complex. Going back to the relationship issue, I am managing not only the content, but my relationship with you, my histories with you, your values and expectations with my relationship. All of that is much more complex in every conversation. And so when we think we can be in multiple conversations at once, it's even harder than multitasking, which research already says it's very difficult for us to do.
I remember the research you're talking about, which people's ability to put a round peg, round hole, square peg, square hole, or whatever it was, changed just if their turned off phone was in their presence. Their ability decreased just from a turned off phone. And so I understand what it is you're saying. Talk to us about solutions. So empathy is one, understanding the presence that's required of you in that moment with that particular audience. What are other tactics?
So I really think in each conversation, you need to think about context. Where am I? Right? What kind of presence do I have? What does presence do my other audience have? What kind of constraints are they dealing with? That kind of connects with empathy. Relationship. What's the relationship I'm trying to foster with the person I'm communicating with? And then message. What's the message I'm trying to share? A lot of times I might be able to share a message with someone, and I could share it with them without really paying very close attention to them. But that has an impact on the relationship I have with them. And so sometimes when we get too focused on message, and not thinking about relationship and the people aspect, then we make decisions about message that maybe the efficiency makes sense, but long term, we're not building the relationship, the trust, the empathy, the understanding that's going to be required for ongoing relationship management, conversation, and trust.
It's interesting. We hear a lot from managers who are trying to onboard a new employee. And you'll have managers of a certain generation talking about, well, to build culture and to see organizational behavior live, I need people to be in person. And yet they might be talking to a generation that acquires and maintains their entire social network on their phone. And so
Right.
the generations are even talking past each other about culture and organizational behavior and the development of these networks. How are you advising organizations and executives to think about that?
I definitely think there's the idea, to your point, that kind of physical in-person space is somehow maybe the best space in certain generation, and that we have to have that. Whereas we have, like you said, a whole generation that has valued not necessarily being in the same space. So I think what's important to think about is, when do I need synchronous, immediate feedback from someone and to engage that feedback, and when don't I? Not so much about the channel, but again, more about synchronous. When do I need dialogue and feedback from someone, and what's the best way to achieve that? And I think especially going into these hybrid workplaces, or all virtual workplaces, or in person some days, virtual the other days, it's really important to be really clear about what the expectations are for different types of meetings, and what type of feedback is needed in different types of meetings. I think a lot of times we waste a lot of synchronous time sharing messages that are not relevant to our audience, or we value this in-person presence because we hope that there's going to be this kind of connection that happens, when actually, if we're not structuring those kind of connections and structuring the dialogue, it's not just going to happen on its own. Prior to the pandemic, many of those conversations could happen on their own because we just happen to be in the container of the workplace. Now that our workplace looks so different, we have to be much more intentional about the type of conversations we want to have in each of these contexts.
So that's requiring managers to do even more complicated and nuanced work. So if you're talking to a manager who says, okay, I understand what you mean, but where do I learn more about it? And do you see people, Professor Turner, who are doing really good current organizational behavior work?
So what I think is really important in light of what you're talking about is to recognize that while there is some great working going on, there's also a lot of new frontiers that need to be established, and we need to co-create those together within our organizations. This idea that there's any one best way. This physical presence is the best way, or, oh, online is the best way. I'm going to work from home. That's my best way. I think it's about creating those conversations together. And that's why I've been doing this research and I work on this book, Being Present, and it's how to command attention at work and home. Really thinking about context, relationship, and message in every conversation that we're in, whether it's at home or at work, and how we have to bring each other together to come up with those norms and guidelines that make sense for everyone.
It's really interesting what you just said, because you're really taking this from an I conversation to a we conversation, right? It's not just where do I work best or where do
Right.
I focus, but where do we do our best work? Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. And in many ways, it's not even just an I, but it's my audience. So when we're thinking about communication, it is often 100% about our audience, because my goal is to get something that's in my head in your head. And I can't control whether you're paying attention to me. I can't control whether you're focused on me. Since the time of Aristotle, I could be thinking about something else, right? But now with all these additional distractions, this additional stress, and this complication of work and home kind of combined in so many ways, my attention span is so much shorter. So being empathic and understanding my audience and thinking about what's my ask for my audience, what is relevant to my audience, why am I sharing this message for my audience? It really, when you're in communication, it's 100% about your audience. For sure, and it'd be great if my perspective was in there too, but recognizing what does my audience need? Why should they care about this message? And what's the presence I need to get this message across so that they can do whatever I want them to do? That's the focus you kind of have to be thinking about.
Have you seen any good research, or have you done any good research about length of time as it relates to this? And so I think part of what we're seeing is meetings that used to start at 8:30 still started with some small talk, and you could get up and get a cup of coffee. There were norms around it'd be okay to take a bite of your yogurt, things that get stranger on camera. It's harder to get up and get a cup of coffee. It's how do you do your bio breaks? So if we're talking about distraction and focus and communication, what about lengths of time that we want people to be able to be focused, and not even mentioning the fact that you have to look at yourself through this whole period of
Right.
time, another distraction, right? And so are you seeing any best practices in terms of how people are breaking up these online experiences?
So absolutely, I think what you have to really be thinking about, and research, we've been doing research on that as well, is that you have to think about your message. For example, in a Zoom meeting like the one that you mentioned, watching myself while I'm also trying to keep track of everybody else create a lot of engagement for me and distraction for me just from all of that. And then for me to then create dialogue, hard to do. So and people are going from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. And so of course they're doing multitasking during these meetings. They're trying to pretend to pay attention while they're getting their emails done, because we're forcing them in that situation. We need to think about maybe focused 10-minute meetings, 15-minute meetings. And do I really need the cameras on for this meeting? Let's talk about why it would be helpful to have the cameras on, or maybe not have the cameras on. What we have to be doing is communicating about how we're communicating, and don't just assume that we need to be keep doing it the way we have been doing it, or any practices that we created during the pandemic in a moment of crisis where we couldn't really be intentional are necessarily the best ones for the organization. So really being thoughtful about coming out of this pandemic, what works best for a Zoom meeting, what works best for synchronous interaction, which is the most expensive space in organization, what makes sense for more asynchronous interaction. It should I maybe send a video with a PowerPoint or a voice over PowerPoint that everyone watches, and then take a 10-minute conversation online for a dialogue about it. So really being thoughtful, or when do I need dialogue and when don't I? And then how do I use presence to support that?
I really love this communicating about communicating. I
Right.
think I would underline your other comment about we were forced into this quite suddenly. But if everybody had said on March 13th of 2020, okay, Monday, we're
Right.
all going to start working in a new way, we would have rebelled. And yet we've
Right.
kind of come back in a really different way where it's hard to have that kind of intentionality. What would you say to someone whose manager is not quite getting this? How do you manage up in a situation where your manager might not be intentional enough?
I think it's challenging, but what's great about communicating about the communication, it's not saying, hey, when you said that to me, that was a complete waste of time, or this 45-minute Zoom meeting that you required me to be at, I actually didn't even have to be here. Because what's happening is that manager's social capital is going way down, right? But to say, I want to be most attentive to the priorities that really matter to you. So let's have a conversation about the channels that we're using and your priorities around response time, your expectations around engagement, so that we can best make the most of the time that you have. And I think people are trying to do that in some ways. Like, for example, if you have a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the workplace and a Monday, Friday at home, people are trying to schedule, oh, I'm going to try to get all my meetings in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. But then what's happening is this inadvertent consequence of that is that people actually aren't building this relationship time when they're in this physical in-person space, which we all thought we needed. And so we have to be mindful about it. If you told me in 6 months, we didn't have the pandemic, we had this March 13th, quick decision. If you said, okay, let's gear up for December 1st, this is going to happen, we would have no way of figuring out how to think about all the decisions we need to make for communication. And in the amount of time that we had, 6 months, right, say. But now we have 2 years of thoughtful, 2 years of practice where we can provide some thoughtful, intentional, strategic focus about, okay, what is working for us? What's not working for us? Going forward, what's going to work for us as a team? And we actually have the excuse to have a conversation about conversation, which we actually have never had in the workplace before, even though we've constantly had situations where our time was wasted, right? So it's not like that hasn't just started, right? So I think having a conversation about how we have conversations, this is the moment to have it and to reflect on what worked and what didn't work and what should work going forward.
This has been so helpful. I could talk to you all day. I should probably start to bring in our other panelists, who I'm sure they have more to add to this conversation. I hope we can have you back. I highly recommend the book Being Present, and I learn every time we're together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, we talked a lot about the impact on communication of hybrid work. Now we're going to turn to actually thinking about the impact on cities. So thank you so much, Professor Gupta, for joining us here today. I'd like to hear your starting kind of at a 30,000 foot level. We saw an exodus out of urban centers at the beginning of the pandemic. Where are we today?
Thanks so much for having me on, Suzanne. So I think the history that's important to keep in mind here is that American cities have actually always had domestic outmigration. They've been filled in instead by foreign immigrants and new births. This pattern actually changed after 2010, when, for one of the first times in American history, we actually saw Americans move into cities. And that was kind of a product of new jobs, new opportunities, particularly in sectors like tech. Well, after 2015, we started to go back to that historic pattern, meaning even before the pandemic, there was already some exodus coming out of cities. That really accelerated during COVID when we saw even increased domestic net migration, increased foreign immigration due to the pandemic itself. So where we are today varies a little bit based on the city. In some cities like New York, domestic net outmigration has reduced, but it's still back to those post-2015 levels, meaning people are still leaving places like New York City. It's just that foreign immigration has kicked back up. Then you have other areas like San Francisco, which are still losing domestic at a quite rapid pace.
So what has this meant for businesses in commercial districts, in urban centers?
So it's been a huge shock for businesses that are centrally located in cities. And that's true both when as talked about, as well as the fact that the remaining residents are coming in the centers of these cities much less frequently than they were before. So that means retail sales are down substantially. Looking at centrally located retail establishments in the center of cities, it means there have been a lot of business failures located in the center of cities. This whole has been a really drastic shock for businesses that are co-located with some of the office towers that are really seeing the big impacts of the pandemic and remote work.
Are you fine? It strikes me there are two follow-up questions there. One is the chicken and egg question. So we are right here in the middle of Washington, D.C., and one of the things we hear from our employees is that the two closest Starbucks closed during the pandemic and haven't reopened. Some of the lunch restaurants and sandwich shops haven't reopened. So you can't get the population back because things aren't open, and things aren't open because the population isn't back. How do you end up cutting into this circle or cycle and solving it?
So I think there are two aspects of that. The first is what you're highlighting, which is that the amenities that are being offered in the centers of cities are less attractive to residents, and that makes it really challenging for cities that are trying to go back. An added complication to what you just mentioned is also the transit system itself. Transit systems all across the country are seeing decreased ridership because people are commuting much less often to the office, and that's going to impose huge operational costs going forward. So there's this challenge that you've identified here, which is how can we make cities more attractive, drive people back in when a lot of the basic services necessary are really seeing big shocks to their functioning. The second part of it is that while there have been these big shocks to the center of cities, suburbs are actually doing a lot better than before. And we're actually seeing increased business activity, new business formation, a lot of which is located in second tier cities or in the suburbs of large cities where you see increased business activity. So relatively speaking, the suburbs are becoming more attractive relative to the centers of cities. And that's an added force that's making it challenging to get people to show back up to the office.
Is there any difference you're seeing between red states and blue states? I mean, you have some politicians' approach to opening and closing was different. Have there been lasting impacts on a return to cities in those states?
I think the data is certainly consistent with that idea. So, for example, we see that cities in Texas or Florida tend to be more often going back fully in person or in some sort of structured hybrid role in which people are coming back in several days of the week. What we see instead in places like San Francisco or Portland or Seattle is a different style of work, which is more heavily focusing on fully remote or a form of hybrid work in which people are coming in less often to the office. And even in a city like New York, you have a lot more reliance on the financial services industry, which is a little bit more in person. You're still nonetheless seeing that less than 10% of workers are coming in 5 days a week. So you're definitely seeing the impacts hit most heavily some of these blue states. That's partly, I think, because of the industrial composition of these cities, focusing heavily on industries like tech that have gone pretty heavily remote. I think it can also reflect the impacts of the lockdowns themselves and people's sheltering decisions, as well as official orders, which meant that firms and individuals in some bluer jurisdictions were investing a little bit more in their home office, whereas workers in some of these Texas cities were coming in sort of the whole time over the pandemic. So I think the data is certainly consistent.
You've described office buildings as kind of ground zero for all of this. What do you mean by that?
Absolutely. So remote work is really a fascinating trend, which is affecting a lot of different sectors of the economy. And real estate is really seeing the effects of this because remote work fundamentally changes where people decide to live and where they decide to work. And real estate values ultimately reflect people's choices in those areas. So office buildings are really seeing the impact because the demand for office leases is just down substantially. Firms are realizing they can either cut their office lease entirely or at least reduce their office footprint in ways that are having really large consequences on office landlords. We're seeing substantially lower demand for office product. We're seeing people come into the office much less frequently. And for all these reasons, I think the office is really going to be where we see the concentrated effects of remote work most cleanly.
I mentioned a second ago being in DC, and our mayor has called for the administration to get federal workers back or to do something else with these office buildings, as you were just describing it. So figuring out the future of what city centers look like if there's hybrid work feels really complicated for mayors and governors and local officials who may not have expertise in this area. So how are you advising experts to think about the city of the future?
It's such an important challenge. And the historical analogy that comes to my mind is the shocks that a lot of cities suffered in the 1960s and 70s in the period of deindustrialization. What we saw in that period is that the industrial hubs that made up the centers of cities actually experienced large declines, and that really negatively impacted a lot of cities. Cities like Detroit never really recovered from the deindustrialization in that period, whereas others like Pittsburgh or New York were able to ultimately reinvent themselves over time, but it was a really period in between. One of my concerns is that remote work has the potential to be one of these disrupting forces, which really just changes the urban fabric and how cities function. Now, it is a big benefit to some cities that are able to actually attract talent from elsewhere, but cities that are currently looking at an existing workforce that's moving remote, like perhaps Washington, D.C., are kind of in the crosshairs of this and really need to think creatively and strategically about how best to retain their residents. Now, there are many parts of that challenge, but I think fundamentally it's about making cities more attractive places for people that want to live and work there, and ensuring that cities can remain great places to be even when people have the choice of working elsewhere.
It reminds me of our last panelist, just thinking about how quickly some of these changes came about and the expertise that's suddenly needed in a new way to think about vibrancy of meetings, of communications, of cities, of workplaces. It's a whole new muscle we're trying to develop at one time. Before I bring in our next panelist, let me ask you, is this city phenomenon unique to the United States, or is it being seen globally post-pandemic?
I think you're seeing similar patterns across many countries that have the types of industrial mixes that are conducive to remote. So, for example, countries like England or Australia have large skilled sectors, saying that a lot of workers are choosing to work remotely, either fully remote or in some sort of hybrid capacity. There does seem to be less of a shift in some places like continental Europe or Japan, which have not adopted remote work to the same extent. So for the time being, it does look like the United States in particular are at the leading edge of this trend, but it is something that is affecting parts of the world that are using technologies and industries that are conducive to this type of shift.
Well, I'm sure we'll have more questions for you in a minute when we bring the audience in, but let me quickly bring in our next panelist because you've provided a really perfect transition. So we are now going to bring in Mark Grinis, Global Real Estate, Hospitality, and Construction Leader at E&Y. And we want to have a minute to talk to Mark about EY's Future Workplace Index. So could you briefly describe those findings?
Yeah, and thanks, Suzanne, for having me. When this pandemic started, we originally, I think we all had the kind of a similar experience where we all had anecdotal, conversations about, how our organizations were navigating it and what were some of the challenges and real broad views of, what was outstanding or maybe what wasn't working so well. And so we started this idea of, we really need a benchmark, a starting point with the workplace index to really be able to evaluate, what is very specific, because the answers and the what's working and not working is very specific. It's specific by job function. It's specific by level. What are the activities of the organization? What sector is it in? What geography is it located? What is customary for that geography? So what we tried to do is put together that perspective and really be able to provide people insights into, what are some of my other clients and other people doing in our particular sector, and what does that look like? So it allows people to kind of measure themselves and evaluate. This is such an important area. We've transformed how we use real estate. We've transformed how our organizations work. People are the most important asset of an organization, and we've really broken the mold, particularly on how we work. And so now when you think about taking that, you've got to rejigger exactly how do you interact with your real estate, what are all the policies and procedures with respect to being remote, how do you navigate your privacy and technology. There's so many different things, and I think our workplace index really looks to provide some solutions and insights to something that, to be honest, I think is evolving and something that was going to change and develop over time.
So if you look at that information, which is of course power as we're trying to make all of these decisions, what is the data telling you about how many employees are fully remote versus fully in the office versus hybrid?
Yeah, so it's as you would imagine, it's a bit of a bookend. So you have call it 20% that are in office full time, 20% that are fully remote, and then you've got the balance of 60% roughly that's in some form of hybrid, and that and the vast majority, and sorry for the numbers, 70% are 2 to 3 days is where people are kind of landing with respect to how their organizations are operating. It's interesting if you take like the Fortune 500 and you kind of put the fully back to work or fully remote and just dot plot where the organizations are. It's a complete a spread of across all parts of that continuum, and quite frankly, some are moving. We saw not too long ago. Twitter kind of flew from one end of the subject to the other end of the bandwidth. So I think companies are experimenting. They're learning what's working and what's not working, and trying to continue to get more information about how is this particularly working for our organization. But where it's falling right now is kind of that 2 to 3 days. I think we all can kind of attest. Even the most ardent in-office people kind of exceed Friday as a bit of a high probability that there's going to be a remote element to it, and certainly providing employees flexibility with that. Mondays is the same way. Is kind of that low, and obviously in the middle is the bell curve where really a lot of activity and people are coming into the office.
Although if I read it correctly, your index says that a large majority of employers say they won't have a central location going forward. So how do we get from here to there if that's actually the trend?
Yeah, it's I think what we're doing is we're a bit defining what space is. I was thinking about this, and if you go back in time a little bit when we started to get mobile phones and we started to be able to be kind of mobile and hey, I'm calling you from my office, like my front car, like that was a phenomena. And yet I think to some extent we're kind of evolving in the sense that we're in different spaces, and that the definition of where we are is going to evolve over time. And that flexibility of a remote space, a home space, a third space, these are all going to kind of morph into just our ability to be very mobile and address our space in our own kind of time zone, in our own way that meets our kind of the needs of the individual, the needs of the employee, and also the priorities and the objectives of the organization. And striking that balance and finding that balance is something that's I think all organizations are addressing.
It's an important point about striking balance, but there's also a confluence of events. You could have the possibility that people are moving at a different rate than space planning. But so if you've got people coming along the curve of, as Professor Turner was just saying, when intentionally do we need to be together doing synchronous work? When am I hybrid? I'm getting intentional about how to lead people and manage an organization in that way. And yet companies are trying to make long-term real estate decisions. So how are you assessing a company's ability to get that real estate decision right?
And that it's such an important question. I think most companies they obviously have a starting point of we need to provide the real estate in the space that really meets the purpose and the objectives of the organization. But then the next question is okay, but I come in many days of the week and we really clearly are not optimizing our real estate. About 60% of people are putting in occupancy sensors. They're figuring out, they're getting reservation systems. They're really starting to measure how space is used, and so that they can make those big decisions. I think one of the most interesting things is office leases are generally in a longer term nature. And so even though we've had this dramatic impact on real estate, not necessarily all the leases have necessarily rolled. They roll gradually over time. We're starting to see, a significant uptick in some of the sublease space as companies are making decisions. I can say even for our own organization, we have leases, all around the world. And different decisions are being made with respect to what we're doing in China, what we're doing in South Korea, which in some cases we're increasing our space. In some cases in Europe, we're maybe moderating it or upgrading a little bit to higher quality, the bigger cities and concentrating. And so there's different answers to make those decisions, but the assessment of how are we really using our space, and quite frankly, most importantly, what's the role of the office? How important is it for our people to come in and collaborate? For most organizations, it's incredibly important. And I think that it's opening up what in my mind is one of the most important areas is how do we really curate and design space that really drives that productivity that we're looking for, that we really earn the commute. We should make the office an amazing place where people come into and have that great experience. It's good for the company. It's good for socialization. But there clearly can be periods of time where remote is a perfectly acceptable solution for part of the work week.
Connecting that to the last speaker, you make a great point about reimagining office space, but also we've been talking about reimagining cities and downtown centers. So what do you think is going to have to happen to make a city center a destination again? Not just so the office is someplace you want to go, but the city itself is a place that earned the commute.
Yeah, I think I want to be careful. I think when you look at what's happening to demand, we're probably on if people could really optimize their real estate and be really efficient, we're probably down 15 to 20% of how much space we really need that's currently out there. And so there's without question, there's kind of an oversupply, for certain markets on how we use space. And obviously what the previous speaker said was, that's affecting, how our downtowns, our experience, our workplace. That will work itself out over time as, construction slows down and office employment starts to recover. I think but in the near term, I think what the most interesting trend is that importance of the workplace is pushing people up the value curve. They're going to the higher quality properties, generally speaking, that are attracting demand. And I think what's the issue is going to be maybe in some of the lower grade office space, maybe some of the secondary locations. How do cities think about those locations? And most importantly, maybe there's a better use. Maybe there's a better use as multifamily. Maybe there's a hospitality solution that makes sense. How can cities look at that real estate? They all want the same thing: vibrant cities, healthy tax bases. So what can we do to incentivize transition for some portion of that stock that could be something else and be far more productive and benefit the communities where that real estate is located? And I think cities are starting to think about that, but I really think that's going to be a real significant trend over the next 2 to 3 years.
Thank you for that. I think it's the perfect segue to bring in our final panelist, Sara Morales from Cisco. Thank you so much for being with us. Let me just ask you about the people part. Maybe you could take us through your journey of kind of how you shifted to remote work and what your journey has been since.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. So appreciate you having me. And one thing, luckily for Cisco, is that we were hybrid before hybrid was a thing. Our employees have been empowered to work flexibly and remotely for many years, luckily using our own technology. So going fully remote was a bit more of a natural shift for us, not completely natural, but we already had kind of that culture of flexibility, the technology, and that mindset built in. One thing that we did incorporate at the start of the pandemic is we started a monthly global check-in for the entire company. And this was really a way for us to lean into connection and care for our people while we were fully remote. They were a source of much needed empathy and two-way communication with our leaders. And it was an opportunity for all of our employees to connect with other employees, with our leaders, and somewhat importantly, medical and other experts leaders for our global workforce. So we brought in a medical advisor in almost every session and a psychologist as well that really helped kind of deal with some of the things, and not just the pandemic, but social justice and war and all of the things that we've dealt with outside of the pandemic. And what we saw is we had about 59,000 unique employees attended about 13 of these sessions over the course of 2022, where our leaders transparently addressed topics across the board. And 87% of our employees rated these as an excellent use of time. And we really kind of made the decision up front to lean into flexibility and let teams decide. So some of the other panelists have talked a little bit about that. And now we're in a bit more of a transitional state with remote, office first, and on-site first really starting to come together. And we're recognizing that there is no one size fits all. Cisco will not have a corporate mandate. Instead, we're really trying to lead with a magnet perspective and encouraging leaders and teams to talk about how they need to work and what they need to work on versus where they need to work to really kind of drive our greatest productivity and figure out how we continue to stay close together.
One of the questions we get a lot from employers is, how do I drive culture, particularly with new employees, if they are opting for a fully remote or largely remote experience? And we've seen some research that suggests the more remote you are, the better your recruitment chances are, but actually that some of your retention numbers can go down. It can just get harder to inculcate culture. So how do you do that with employees and teams that are choosing, to your point, to be fully remote?
Yeah, and I think that is one of the talent pools that we are focusing on in particular around our new workforce. And I heard Dr. Turner mention around kind of the generational workforce as well. So those are some of the talent pools that we are focusing on. We have actually recreated an onboarding approach across the company. I will share that there's an internal project called Project Sweatpants in terms of how we onboard our employees internally, where we really provide them with an experience at home for how they can onboard from a technology standpoint, get connected, and kind of stay engaged with their coworkers, even when they are remote. Sorry about that. What we are also seeing is that that onboarding experience, we are asking leaders to do more. Now, we know, we've done some research on this, we know that leaders are playing such a bigger role since the pandemic, and they are carrying more of the burden. However, we are trying to enable and engage our leaders to really play a different role, not only in the onboarding, but in the development and skilling of our employees so that way they stay engaged.
I think you made an excellent point, and it's something else we hear a lot about, which is the management skills really need to be taken up a notch. Or the more management training, the pressure on managers to not only perform but bring their teams along, as Dr. Turner was saying, and others with completely new skills. So, is it changing your approach to management training and leadership development?
Yes, and I mean, we know that navigating change has always been a challenge for people managers. I mean, whether, again, we talk about, going through the pandemic, we've had several social justice challenges and issues over the course of the past couple of years. Again, we've had, war in Europe. And as a global company, I think asking our leaders to take on this change management approach and really also asking our leaders to not only play the role of supervisor in terms of work, but also at times play the role of therapist, also play the role of, now we're asking them to be event planners. Mark talked a little bit about kind of engaging in the office and what that looks like. I think having that return on commute, making it meaningful and worthwhile when employees do come into the office. And so we have implemented a few different programs for our leaders, really kind of starting with how does our team need to come together, engaging them in a conversation and training them to have the conversation with their teams around what is our work and how do we collectively want to come together, remote, in office, asynchronously, synchronously, but also And again, Dr. Turner talked a little bit about empathetic leadership. That is another thing that we are really working with our leaders around how to lean more into empathetic leadership. And I will say that comes directly from the top in terms of our CEO, Chuck Robbins, leading the way.
So, question for you around the talent market. We see labor shortages in a lot of key sectors, talent shortages in a lot of key sectors, key roles in certain geographies. How does that play into this? And I guess I'm saying that because I hear from a lot of employers who feel that they have to adjust to what they think the talent wants so that they can recruit them and retain them, but also some fear that people may not know what they want. And so how do you to listen to what people are saying and not saying in that moment? So question is really around talent market. Is some of your approach here a reaction to that?
I think it's both a reaction, and one of the things that we have been focused on for quite some time is attention. And in particular, attention between leaders and employees. And part of that is a conversation with leaders and employees to say, what do you most care about? What are the most important things for you? Help me understand, who you are as a person, your values. These are kinds of conversations that I think can help inform leaders, not only about the day-to-day work, but longer term aspirations for their employees. We help our leaders drive a quarterly career conversation, but also a weekly check-in with their employees on what are some of the things you loved this week? What are some of the things you loathed this week? And what are your priorities for this week? And how can I best support you? So I think that ongoing attention can absolutely play a role in that engagement and retention. With regards to the hot talent market, one of the things that we as a company are focusing on right now is in particular around reskilling and skilling, as well as moving talent internally. I've had a number of conversations with my peers in the tech industry, but also other industries, and I feel like reskilling and skills is a little bit of the people word of the year. But we're really trying to create easier career paths through our company. And one of our mantras is one company, many careers. I feel like I am a benefit of that, but many others really think about how can I continue to grow my career within this company, which has a culture that I align to from a values perspective. One of the things we're doing actually next month, we're hosting a company-wide event called Illuminate Your Career, which is really going to be focused on our career strategy and supporting employees at every stage of their career. Internally, within this past fiscal year, we actually had 40% of our hiring was sourced with internal talent. And we're thinking more and more about how we leverage our internal talent for different roles. And again, continue to build on skills and move talent internally so they can continue to grow their careers. One last thing I'll say, and this came out of a number of studies, but in particular one that we've been focused on, where we know that choice and flexibility are going to be key to holding on to talent in this new hybrid world. Hybrid allows us, and you mentioned this, but allows us to reach the best talent wherever they may be and taps into different markets where we find the best person no matter where they live. And that great talent wants that choice and flexibility at the same time having a great experience of culture, inclusion, and opportunity.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation, I think, for some smaller towns and smaller companies who are now competing with you for talent when they didn't have to right before. So if you think about the small businesses who might be listening, who may not have your resources, what do you think the lessons for a small business trying to compete for talent in this market? What advice would you have for them?
Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities, even for small businesses, around building skills and thinking about, again, attention doesn't change. I think providing attention, providing coaching, providing opportunities that might feel challenging and exciting for employees to continue to grow their skills. I also think these connection points and visibility opportunities that show an investment in your talent and in your teams, and getting to the heart of what feels most important to them. I think big or small, these are the kinds of conversations that lead an employee to want to stay and feel loyal to their workplace.
We're getting some audience questions, so I want to try to get them in here before the end of show. So let me go first back to Professor Gupta. I just want to ask you on behalf of the audience, what is the best source of both national and regional data if I'm trying to understand returning workforce?
Yeah, so there are a number of interesting data sources to look at here. So one source comes from the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So they have an active remote work measure. The ACS, American Community Survey, is also measuring remote work as a part of their general survey. There are a few other sources as well. So Professor Nick Bloom at Stanford and their team, they have a great website where they release a lot of survey evidence on remote work. And finally, there's an interesting data provider called Scoop, which has released data on corporate remote working plans, hybrid, fully remote as well. So a lot of different data sources that track different aspects of how individuals and firms have been moving towards remote work.
Thank you for that. And I have an audience question for you, Mark. Are the majority of employers downsizing their physical space right now? The majority?
No, it's about a third that have indicated that their intention is to downsize. About 2/3 on the other side said that they're going to invest in it. And it doesn't necessarily mean expanding their footprint, but what it does mean, and in some cases it is, but in other cases it's making an investment and really, reimagining and redesigning some of the space. So I would say on that 2/3 are actually looking to put money into real estate.
A follow-up question is, what are your projections for where that is 5 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, I think 5 years from now, I think, the natural supply and demand is going to pull back office construction. And so that, that will allow for things to equalize. Will it be in 5 years? Maybe not quite. And maybe some certain submarkets are being impacted more than others. Some of the southern regions and the southern part are still doing quite well. And so they may outperform some of the major metro areas. So it's a slightly different answer, but I think it will be, it will recover and be back in balance probably pretty close to 5 years.
It's kind of a funny question, right? Because the whole takeaway from this episode has been we couldn't have guessed any of this 5 years ago. So now we're saying, what will it be like 5 years from now, as if we can predict going forward the next black swan event, right? But doubling down on my prediction question, I mean, Professor Gupta, are you in the same place 5 years from now?
But I think one thing you really have to look at in the long term is when you look at startups, when you look at young companies, they're overwhelmingly choosing remote first. And that's because they're finding they can save enormously in terms of their own leasing expenditures. And they're really in a position to rethink this whole equation because they're starting from scratch. They don't have legacy office buildings they have to worry about. And so I think the real question is going to be, what are these high growth startups going to do 5 years from now? Are they going to look more like firms today and invest in office space over time? Or are they actually going to invest and figure out how to make remote work out better for them, and in so doing kind of change the dynamics of how companies operate? If that's the case, I think you would have a drastically different office demand situation in the future.
Sara, one of the things that's interested me today is no one has mentioned childcare, and yet I hear a lot about the lack of childcare post-pandemic, how many childcare centers went out of business, how many teachers have been drawn into different parts of the cycle, and the lack of affordable, reliable childcare is keeping too many working parents on the sidelines right when business, of course, needs them in the market. And so how are you addressing or hearing about childcare as a concern?
It definitely is coming up. I think a couple things. For places where we have large sites, and there are a few, one of the things that we did first was reopen our daycare centers. That was something that we absolutely heard from our employees first and foremost. Now, I know that that is a benefit that not everyone has the luxury for. And one of the things that we also talked about was providing our employees emergency time off. So if they need to go care for a child, a parent, whatever the case might be, we've provided them some additional time off to go and do that. I think overarching, it's interesting because in one of these all employee check-ins, our CEO's granddaughter came in, and it was a perfect example of the new way that we're starting to work, and kind of gave permission to many people to say, if your child needs to come in while you're working, we can make that work. Now, on the flip side of that, we know that that feels stressful. And so I think the way that we're balancing that is trying to understand how we get, again, lean into flexibility, and knowing that we will have some people, and in particular, we've seen women leave the workforce more. I think one of the things that we're having quite a bit of conversations about, and I think other companies are as well, is really thinking about returnships. And culturally, and I was just in India, we were having this conversation there. There are a few different life events where females in particular leave the workforce. And so how do we think about attracting talent back at the right points in individuals' lives? And how do we think about that on an ongoing basis, in particular in relation to the pandemic? But I think generally it's something I think we're going to have to continue to work through and balance.
It's an interesting concept, a returnship. And Mark, maybe I'll just ask you this question. We talked a little bit about cities and mixed use and reimagining downtown spaces. Do you think that an increase in office childcare centers or shared spaces that way might be part of the future of cities?
Yeah, look, I think, you can just tell from Sara, how thoughtful they are about, as an organization, and thinking about it. We kind of categorize it as putting people at the center of any strategy. And so I think elements of that, and even our survey identified that amongst other kind of benefits and amenities that employers should really be thinking about, or what they're thinking is important for retention. We still are in an incredible competition for talent, and the role and the importance of city centers and the commute. Such benefits as that childcare and other things are very important to get people into the office, and I think it benefits the company, and it's obviously a nice amenity for the employees. So yes, I think it's critical, and I think a lot of companies are thinking about it.
One of the comments I made earlier with Dr. Turner was we all went to remote work on a dime. Right? On March 13th of 2020, if you had said this is how we're going to go work for a while, we all would have said we weren't ready. And yet we've come back in this varied and kind of uneven way. And I think the question for all of us as employers is going to be, how do we do it well? How do we serve our customers and our shareholders and our communities, as well as our our employees? And how do we do that for the long run? How do we do that for our successors, not just for this moment? So I really appreciate the three of you and Dr. Turner being with us for this conversation. It's something we're all going to be hard at work on, and I hope we can continue to learn from you as large and small employers across the country try to figure out the people piece, the comms piece, the space piece, the city piece. And we appreciate your contributions today. Thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in. We hope today's discussion was helpful to you as we're all trying to figure this out and navigate it. Our next path forward will be in April. Stay tuned for the details. In the meantime, the Foundation will host its 13th annual International Women's Day Forum on March 7th, and you can learn more at uschamberfoundation.org. Thanks very much.